Like other areas of Greater Miami, Miami Gardens as a geographical region predates by at least 2 to 3 millennia the community we know by that name today. The western regions of Miami Gardens represented till the last century the eastern edge of the Everglades, a river of grass that hosted Tequesta Indians, or native Miamians, thousands of years earlier.
Today's Northwest Dade County, of which Miami Gardens is a very large part of, much of it was Everglades swampland as recently as 100 plus years ago. By the beginning of the 1800s, the Tequesta Indians kind of disappeared. But another group of Native Americans coming from Georgia, from the Creek Nation, that we call Seminoles and sometimes Miccosukkees, they in many ways took their place. And they used the swamplands, part of which would comprise today's Miami Gardens, as their place to live, to hunt, to boat, to what have you.
Immediately east of the Everglades, in the vicinity of today's Sun Life Stadium, lies the Honey Hill Archaeological Site, one of the most significant military sites in the eastern Everglades. Archaeologists in recent decades have uncovered there strong artifactual evidence of a military camp from the era of the Seminole Wars, which were military campaigns waged between U.S. forces and Seminole Indians for the expressed purpose of removing the latter to Indian country, or today's Oklahoma.
Everglades drainage was a dream of a lot of Floridians, even when Florida was a territory, not even a state in the United States. It became a state in 1845, and that dream just kind of grew at that time. By the early 1900s, Everglades drainage was something that was a major issue and a major goal of the administration of Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, governor of Florida, elected in the early 1900s. Most of Northwest Dade was undeveloped in terms of a residential community until after World War II. There were lots of dairy farms there were lots of regular farms there were some hardy pioneers there. I say hardy because it was isolated, there weren't many roads, mosquitoes were terrible, there was a lot of flooding. But after the war, that's a logical area for development, and especially when a lot of partly subsidized housing comes along, what we call veterans housing. And so you begin to see a lot of housing there, including what's called Carroll City, which begins to develop in the early 1950s.
Carroll City became the first hot-button development to emerge from the north-central region of Dade County. Geared towards veterans of the recent conflict, with much fervor, the area went on the market in the mid-1950s.
The folks who moved into Carroll City in the beginning, the early 1950s, through the mid-50s, through the late 50s, tended to be white, middle class, rising middle class, that is, for the first time achieving what today we would use as a benchmark of middle class. They had to trek a distance to get to work, but they thought it was worth the sacrifice to have for the first time a home.
The area that ultimately becomes Miami Gardens is one that grows tremendously during the mid part of the 20th century, as developers recognize there's a lot of money to be made by building housing for black populations as the city's beginning to expand.
And they're being marketed in the same way, and they're building tract housing in the same way. And in the case of Bunch Park, it's segregated.
The area was developed really for black veterans in the early 50s.
We thought we were getting in a mansion when we got here, because having that many children and having 4 bedrooms was a big joy to have.
Bunch Park had everything that we needed.
Our own shopping mall, grocery store, gas stations, churches.
They had a bakery. They had 2 beauty shops. They had a barber shop. They had a bar. It was nice, you know.
From our home, we would walk to the movies, we'd walk to the bowling alley, we'd walk to the swimming pool. So everything was like right there for us.
So you've got this phenomenon. In other words, there's great growth in Miami. Dade County's population in 1940, according to the U.S. Census, was about 265,000 people. Dade County in 1950 had more than 450,000 people. Dade County in 1962 had 1 million people.
With a population explosion came those institutions and businesses serving these new communities. Northwest 27th Avenue, long an entryway into Greater Miami from points north, and Miami Gardens Drive, Northwest 183rd Street, became major thoroughfares.
The community is being built at the same time. There's a residential element being built at the same time that there's farming nearby. So some were engaged in farming, like dairy farming. But within a matter of a handful of years, there's the Palmetto Expressway coming through there. And what happens with that, among other things, there's a rising of an industrial park nearby. And some people got jobs working in furniture businesses there and what have you within the industrial park. That's up and going by the end of the 1950s.
So in 1946, the state Supreme Court of Florida finally decides they want to start enforcing the rules and the guidelines that make racial zoning illegal or unconstitutional. Prior to that, even though the Supreme Court had decided in 1917 that you couldn't separate populations explicitly on racial lines, people were practicing segregation informally for the better part of 30 years. A developer by the name of Wesley Garrison, who actually was a contemporary of Julius Gaines and other developers in North Dade, begins to break down some of the barriers in places like Brownsville, then around Liberty Square and Liberty City as well, moving up into Bunch Park in the 1950s and 60s. And there begins to be a recognition that these populations are going to continue to expand, and many of the white neighboring communities are in fact quite fearful of them.
In the late 1960s, federal efforts for integration and fair housing enabled African Americans to seek homeownership in communities that were formerly restricted to people of color. This resulted in a black population explosion in the North Dade area.
There was a migration north by most of the black people, which went from Overtown, Liberty City, and then to what was known then as Carroll City. So my parents were part of that migration.
It was a beautiful working class community. You knew that you were moving into a neighborhood where you would want to raise your children.
It was unincorporated Dade County back then, but we all thought we lived in Opelika because that's what our mail said.
Unincorporated areas were governed largely by an all-white county commission, which meant that black folk, even if they lived in these suburban neighborhoods and were looking for better services, they were not in charge of their own trash collection. They were not in charge of the way their sewage was going to be processed.
It was so many things that, we didn't have the kind of parks and rec. We didn't get the same kind of police services.
And so one of the most important kind of early moments of civic engagement for black suburban residents was basic things like just getting water fountains built at the black schools in places like North Dade.
It was just a litany of things that we did not have that other communities had.
The trade-off in many of these cases was actually that black suburban homeowners had to agree to have public housing projects built into their neighborhoods through making these kind of tacit deals with county commissioners.
And what happened in the 60s, but especially the 70s, especially in the 80s and 90s, in that Carroll City area was a lot of Section 8 housing went up, a lot of subsidized housing went up. The people who qualified for it tended to be heavily Hispanics and African Americans.
Betty Ferguson became the first commissioner that was elected out of a black community, a black district, and that was a long process of litigation. And so that did initially give us that whole issue and to be heard and to have someone to listen to our issues and our problems, and that started it.
City of destiny.
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 Destiny. People did not understand.
It was a very hard-fought initiative.
Because they don't know about it. They don't know what it means to incorporate themselves.
Destiny. What? Destiny? What kind of name is that for a town?
After a failed effort to launch Destiny as a city, in 2001, a new committee was formed to continue to pursue incorporation efforts.
So now it's a bigger area, it's a bigger city.
It would take the discrete neighborhoods, the Bunch Park, the Rolling Oaks, the Scott Lake, the Crestviews, the Bajas, the Carroll City areas, the Norwood areas. It would take all of them, it would consolidate them, and it would allow us to form and forge our way together.
In May 2003, the city of Miami Gardens emerged as a newly incorporated entity, becoming Miami-Dade County's third largest city with a population of more than 110,000 residents.
We initially started this fantastic beautification process in the city. We got people to be involved in cleaning up their own properties. We did a lot with litter control. We started doing these tree giveaways where we had people planting trees and foliage, and we started having recognition, really around the country.
These are the type of things that cities do, but they build community pride. Because from my perspective, I want to build a community that when these kids, when they have an opportunity to leave, they say, I'm from Miami Gardens.
there are more and more positive things that are happening in the city of Miami Gardens. If we continue to spread the good news, then pretty soon the good news will catch on.
I think things got just a little bit better. We're in a city now that we can live. In this area here, I love it here. My wife loves it.
It's an extraordinary pleasure for me to be the mayor of this, the third largest city in the county, but I don't think of it as the third largest city in the county. I think of it as the place I grew up, the people I grew up with, and how we want to go forward together.
Miami Gardens is a bold new city. It represents a city of the future for the fact that its demographics are a bellwether for the nation itself. With a thriving environment for business, culture, sports, and entertainment, the city of Miami Gardens continually pursues its founder's vision of becoming a world-class destination.